What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and this is one of the coolest stories that Marvel has done regarding Thanos in years. And in fact, they give him what is a new origin here, but they also build on the idea of the original Infinity Gauntlet story, which is just absolutely phenomenal. So one of the things that's been going on with Thanos here in Marvel Comics, for those of you all who are either new here or haven't been following along, is that Thanos has been dead for a little while. He basically came back to a degree during Kieran Gillen's Eternals run, but it was him trying to regain his original body and power. Ultimately, he was defeated at the end of that run, and he's been gone ever since. But the other part of this equation is that Thor, having replaced Odin as the All-Father of Asgard, has been having these visions of basically Thanos showing up and leading an army of dead Avengers, right? Like Marvel Zombies is what it looks like, but leading an army of dead Avengers against any number of whatever those forces happen to be, while also wielding Mjolnir with the Infinity Stones attached to it. And on his other hand, he has an Infinity Stone that we've never seen before. And so while these visions have plagued Thor for a while now, he travels to Titan in order to gain a better understanding of whether or not Thanos is alive, if there's any evidence or any clues as to what he's been doing to try to attain this level of power, anything that can point him into the direction of understanding what in the world is going on. Now, the crazy thing about this is that when he gets there, he ends up encountering Mistress Death. And one of the things she says is that she actually lingers in this place more than she lingers anywhere else. Now, this is building on the old Thanos Rising storyline, which was the first real origin, at least a comprehensive origin that we got for Thanos in Marvel Comics. The long and short of that origin story is that Thanos had actually been manipulated by Mistress Death ever since he was a little kid, and ultimately she kind of led him down the path of him becoming who he is. That's going to change over the course of this story. But the other thing that Thor does as he makes his way through here is he discovers what is quite literally a giant filing cabinet along with a room full of different artifacts. Now, all these things had been collected over the years by the father of Thanos, who had basically chronicled Thanos' actions after Thanos initially left Titan and went out on his own, having just done all these horrible and terrible things. But one of the things Thanos had done was come back to Titan and actually provide a sort of memoir of his own histories and the things that he had achieved and accomplished over the course of his life. Now, a lot of those things aren't necessarily documented here. One of the cool things we get is kind of an early prototype of the Infinity Gauntlet, basically a makeshift glove that's basically sewn together, and that could have been used for it. Of course, Thanos went with something with a little more posh, a little more polished when he had the original Infinity Gauntlet story. But what it does is it jumps to the first time that Thanos appeared in Marvel with Iron Man issue number 55. Now, one of the things to know is that with Thanos' first appearance, it was not the true Thanos. It was actually a robotic version of Thanos. It was kind of a test by Marvel to see whether or not there was any interest in a character like that. When fans immediately loved it, Marvel ended up revealing or introducing the real Thanos that was accompanied by Mistress Death. So at the point this story is being written, Iron Man has encountered the robot Thanos and is just trying to figure out how to turn it on. Because the truth is, as intelligent as Iron Man is, Thanos is just that much smarter. One, because he's just been around that much longer, and two, because his experience with technologies and things like that is far more wide and reaching than Iron Man's is. One of the things to remember is that Tony Stark has spent like 90% of his life on Earth. So while he is exceedingly intelligent, his understanding of most all technologies in the early days of his character's publication history were confined to Earth. Now, over the years, Iron Man has left Earth and he's gone out into space and he's encountered all kinds of different extraterrestrial races with the Avengers, without the Avengers, with ForceWorks, the team that he had that replaced the Avengers for a little while, or at least the West Coast Avengers team. So his knowledge on alien technology has expanded quite a bit since the time this story was written. But that's why there's a lot of frustration here, is because Tony Stark's like, I'm a futurist, right? I am ridiculously capable with machines. I can't even figure out how to turn this thing on, let alone fully understand it. Now, this is when we start to invoke the original Infinity Gauntlet story. I know it sounds weird because this takes place before Infinity Gauntlet. So here's the thing. So eventually Iron Man gets frustrated and goes to simply just destroy the machine. And that's when it wakes up. And it literally says, it would be a pity to annihilate such a work of art. And where Tony Stark is like, what in the world are you talking about? This, like the Thanos robot basically chimes in and arrives with a bit of a warning. And what it says here is that in the future, Thanos is going to attain absolute power. Now, we know by virtue of this that this is Thanos attaining the Infinity Gauntlet. And what it says is that in the far future, meaning years and years and years after Thanos originally gets the Infinity Gauntlet, he rules everything. And so what this story does, and it's one of the coolest things here, what it does is it puts forward the idea that the Marvel Universe, as it exists right now, is not actually happening. That what had taken place when Thanos had got the Infinity Gauntlet is he had just reworked reality, right? Controlled reality. And that is kind of an illusion, right? A veil. It is all the Earth superheroes, and even us as the reader, seeing a series of events. We can call those events A, which is basically everything that's happened since the original Infinity Gauntlet story. Infinity War and Infinity Crusade and Civil War and House of M and Decimation, all that kind of stuff. None of that's happened. What's actually going on is circumstance B, where Thanos is just controlling everything from behind the scenes. He just rules it all. And it's literally the Matrix, right? That's basically what's being invoked here. And so the result of this is that he tells Iron Man, if you destroy this robot, then for the rest of eternity, you and everybody you know, everybody on Earth, everyone in existence, will basically be made to endure a life of torture. That's what's going to happen, right? An eternity of that. Just endless pain. Or you can let this robot continue on and you can do your thing. Because in truth, Thanos wants to ensure that the events that transpire that lead to him getting the Infinity Gauntlet, that it actually happens. Now, in truth, because he has the Infinity Gauntlet in the future, and because he is controlling all things, the end result of that is guaranteed. This is really just more for Thanos' own entertainment. But again, this is simply just an idea that's put out there. Marvel doesn't explicitly say if that's the case, but just based on this possibility, and based on the fact that it may actually happen, Iron Man chooses not to destroy the robot, and ultimately lets it continue on and do its thing. Now from here, it jumps to a different story that took place in Thanos' life, which involves a girl named Corella. Now this is a story that may or may not be controversial to Marvel comic fans, and really even to Thanos fans. That what happens here, and kind of an ambiguous set of events that lead to this happening in the first place, Mistress Death brings Thanos to her and says like, hey, there's kind of an imbalance out there in the universe, I'm gonna need your unique perspective. Basically the buildup that we saw in Marvel The End, when Thanos attained the heart of the universe and then wiped out the entirety of the multiverse and then reconsolidated it, kind of like resetting everything to a degree, but not really. Marvel undid that, and then they said that Marvel The End is no longer in continuity, and it was a wasted opportunity. But what ends up happening is that to better understand Thanos' perspective, Mistress Death actually whisks him away and brings him to what is the realm of the undead, right? To her realm proper. Now, here's one of the things to understand. The realm of Mistress Death is not an actual, it's not depicted as an absolute place. That it changes based on what story is being told. In the old Chris Claremont era, it was just a series of pillars, and people were living their lives inside these pillars, right? There's just little things like that, right? The depiction changes from time to time. But the overall gist of this is that when Thanos asks, why did you bring me here? The response of Mistress Death is to speak of love. When Thanos responds and saying, I love only you, she says today, but today has not always been today, has it? And that's when we're introduced to Corella. Now, the funny thing about this is that as we're being told here, Corella is a girl that Thanos knew in his younger days. That this is really her spirit. It's not an actual version, the physical version of Corella. It's Mistress Death simply saying, I like she's presented here to you because I want to understand more about this woman that you fell in love with at some point along the line. And so this is when the origin of Thanos changes. When the original story was done in Thanos Rising, what it told us is that he was basically an outcast because of his physical appearance. That he was looked down upon by other Eternals. The result of this is that being an outcast and feeling basically ostracized from society, Thanos started finding companionship when he could, where he could. The first and really only form of companionship he ever found came in the form of Mistress Death, who appeared as a little girl, and she goaded him down the path of doing exceedingly dark things, experimenting and so on and so forth, which ultimately set him on the path of becoming Thanos as we know him. And then even once he learned he had been manipulated by Mistress Death, he'd fallen so far down the dark path there was no way for him to come back. And in fact, he fell in love with the idea of Mistress Death and had basically been the version of Thanos that we've known ever since, who's been trying to impress her, right? The universal simp. And so the result of this is that this origin changes things up. What it actually says here is a lot of him being ostracized by society, being an outcast, that all remains intact. But there was a girl named Corella that actually took pity on him and learned to love him. And the two of them fell in love. And in fact, it's a very, very beautiful story, right? He says, "To find a mate was all but forbidden to me. I had resigned myself to walking my path alone until Corella arrived." And he says, "When she looked at me, she did not see the monster, the deviant. She saw the spirit within me. Her voice gentled, her touch soothed me. And when I looked in her eyes, I saw not just love, but the possibility of hope. For the first time, I experienced hope." Can you even imagine? At my insistence for her protection, we kept our love a secret, but secrets have a way of escaping. And over time, people began to learn that Thanos was spending time with Corella, that the two of them were basically in a relationship, which people didn't want to see. One of the things to understand here, and it's really interesting the way that it's done, when it came to Eternals, they were very much only people who look like us are allowed to procreate. And the reason why I say that is because with Thanos' physical appearance and him having a deviant gene, he was an outcast. The idea behind the Eternals and the Deviants is that they had waged war against each other for years. And so in effect, Thanos was a person with the gene that belonged to a rival faction, to literally the arch enemy of the Eternals themselves. And the result of this is that they ended up basically running away together. Literally, Thanos says, "Concerned about the overpopulation of my world, I planned to set out to explore other worlds to see if I could find a solution. I was to go alone, and so they acted. When Corella arrived, determined to accompany me, I tried to argue, but I could never win, not with Corella. As I said, she gentled me. Then, just as we were beyond the last of the great cities, out of range of quick help, their actions bore fruit. They sabotaged the ship. They literally destroyed it." Now, here's the big kicker here, right? Here's one of the big things that happens here. This is one of those instances when Marvel Comics is adjusting what it does to fit the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It wasn't always that way. It was the MCU basically borrowing from the comics. Now it's the comics copying the movies. So the way this worked in the original Thanos story, Thanos didn't really care about overpopulation. That was never his thing. That was a plot from Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. It was wholly unique to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Thanos never cared about overpopulation in a world. If anything, the fact that a world was overpopulated was a great thing because it meant more sacrifices for Mistress Death. That's literally what it was. And so in this instance, Thanos having left Saturn's moon Titan, left Eternal Society, was because they had cast him out. Of course, he swore revenge, and then one day he returned and wiped out everybody on Titan, really everybody except for his dad, and then of course ultimately ended up destroying him, shortly after that. But it wasn't really because of some altruistic motivation. It wasn't really, God, there's just too many people and not enough resources. We got to find a way to fix this. What this story does is it drastically changes the way that we see him. Instead of him seeing a guy who was just some kind of demagogue and demigod who was hell-bent on impressing a cosmic entity and being an ultimate nihilist, instead, he's now humanized. It's more of a victim story when it came to Thanos. Because what ended up happening here is that in order to find help, and because oxygen was basically running out, there was only enough oxygen for one of them to survive. Corella gave her oxygen to Thanos and then went out into the wilderness to try to find aid, and of course ultimately ended up dying. But the idea behind Corella and what she was trying to teach Thanos here was the value of life, the meaning of life, and the significance of life. The fact that she was willing to sacrifice hers to save Thanos was a hope that Thanos would use that mindset going forward and try to make the universe a genuinely better place. Of course, the opposite happened. Instead, because Mistress Death had intervened and manipulated Thanos, because of the fact that he had seemingly learned the wrong lesson, Thanos went forward believing that because the ship was sabotaged by those who didn't want to see him and Corella together, that they are a reflection of the universe at large. He's literally a guy with a broken heart. That's really what it was, right? It's no longer Thanos, the guy who wanted to conquer everything. It's Thanos' heart was broken by some guys who were dicks, and now the universe is going to pay for it. And so this changes everything about Thanos. But that's why I say this is controversial, and that's why this story itself is controversial. Because Thanos as a character has always been the guy where he literally is just a really, really terrible person who's always been a terrible guy. Well, not necessarily always, after he was manipulated by Mistress Death, which again is a kind of victimization story that goes on there. So all we're doing is just kind of changing the villains of Thanos' own history from Mistress Death to a handful of folks on Titan. That's really all it is. But again, people become attached to comic book stories for reasons that make sense to nobody but themselves. And the result of this is they go forward wanting to see that story stay intact, and they don't want things to be changed. Sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's a problem. With this one, this is really an instance where Marvel is bringing Thanos closer to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But because of the fact that this sort of appears out of left field, it looks like Thanos, one, will probably return in the MCU, which makes good sense because he's so popular, and two, even if he doesn't return, his origin story is going to be explored further in the Eternals 2 film, and that this will be a part of his origin story. But as Thor is kind of sifting through all these files and looking through all these different things, that what Thor ends up finding is something called the Black Stone, and that ultimately this Black Stone is gone. And Thor, of course, says whoever searched this place got what they came for. And that's when he realizes his grandfather, Bor Odin's son, the father of Odin, is actually involved in this in some capacity. We don't know how far-reaching it is, but at the end of the day, Thor doesn't really get a whole lot of answers, except for this kind of new mystery that like his grandfather's somehow involved. It does send him on another path, and it kind of keeps this journey going, which of course Marvel will continue doing, likely in the pages of Thor. But it is fun, and in fact, it actually does continue in Thor number 29, but it is fun, and it is really, really cool. So, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.